Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be talking about the market revolution, which is one of the more important events in American history that you've probably never heard of. So, here are your basic market revolution objectives. Pause and take a moment to take them in, keeping in mind that we'll be back to them at the end. And without further ado, let's talk about the market revolution. The United States existed in this sort of weird historical estuary with the waters of traditional mercantilism mixing with this new thing called capitalism. And so when the United States was coming of age, Great Britain had already gone through or was currently going through the first industrial revolution and quite frankly was moving towards the second industrial revolution. And so all of those forces slowly started to seep into the United States, and we started to see a transformation of American society. It should be noted that the government played a big role in this by strongly protecting patents and trademarks in order to encourage people to create new things with the idea that they would then have exclusive use of them at least for some time. So a bunch of different things kicked off the market revolution, but one piece was the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 was one of our first massive American financial collapses, and it happened for a bunch of different reasons. Part of it was the post-war drop-off from the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars. Part of it was speculation and land values from all the land opened up from the war, which we talked about previously. And part of it was, quite frankly, terrible bank policy from the Bank of the United States. The second Bank of the United States was not run as well as the first Bank of the United States, and as opposed to expanding access to credit in order to help soften the financial collapse, instead they cut back on credit and cut back on currency, deepening the crisis. This unfortunately undermined, in a lot of people's minds, the legitimacy of the Second Bank of the United States and would make it one of the key focal points in the political revolution that was about to take place. The panic also led to a bunch of people losing money on investments in Western land and a bunch of people losing their land. And so what you started to see was a slow movement to urban areas where if people in rural areas lose land or don't have opportunities, or if the price of land becomes too high, people start to move to cities where there are new industries growing and there's more economic opportunities. So you start to see, especially along the Great Lakes and sort of on the East Coast, the growth of American cities. So the market revolution itself is the idea that we're starting to get more mass-produced goods flooding into the market. So for the vast majority of American history, this doesn't apply to people living in cities, of course, who are always getting things imported. But for many people throughout most of American history, you would have to create or make most of the things that you use. Your house, most of the tools, most of the supplies, most of the clothing. Whereas with the market revolution, Americans started producing more of their own goods, partially because of protective tariffs that protected these new fledgling industries from foreign competition. And so Americans started buying more of their own goods that were produced within the United States, creating a larger market and this growth of industry. So we still end up seeing a significant amount of foreign trade, but after the war. But the War of 1812 really convinced a lot of people, as we talked about previously, that depending on foreign trade was not ideal because, one, it's one of the things that got us into the war in the first place. And two, when all of Europe goes to war against itself, those supplies get cut off. And now all of a sudden in the United States, we have a dearth of clothing or manufactured goods or supplies. So there was a clear desire to develop domestic industry during this time period. This started, of course, with home manufacture, with the putting out system, with wealthy people sending piecework uh, to individual poor houses. But over time, we started to see consolidations into factories. This, of course, had been happening in England going all the way back to the 1600s, but it was relatively new in the United States. And hopefully you remember from world history the advantages of factories. You're centralizing labor, you're centralizing equipment, you're able to buy more comprehensive equipment and streamline production processes. And so the factory system greatly expanded the productive capacity of the United States. We also started to see interchangeable parts and the standardization of parts. We give generally credit to this for Eli Whitney, who, in addition to inventing the cotton gin, which we'll talk about a little bit later, created interchangeable parts for rifles and for guns, which makes it much easier to both produce these products and then also to repair them. Because if a part breaks, you can simply replace it with an identical part. This had the effect of one, making goods more cheap, but on the other hand, this upset the traditional guild system with artisans, skilled artisans, crafting all of these products. Now you didn't need to be a master artisan in order to make any of these new goods. You could simply assemble any of these products from pre-produced parts, which is going to create massive economic disruption. You also start to see the advent of child labor and especially young women in these factories because on the one hand, the work is becoming simpler so a child can do it, and on the other hand, you had all these kids who are like sitting around in cities like just wasting their days. They might as well be doing something productive and earning some money for their families. Lowell Mills is the first example of one of these factory towns. It's in Massachusetts, and it was a place that attracted mostly young, unmarried farm girls from New England who would come and spend a couple years in Lowell Mills, making some money for their families, and then would go back home and get married. So it was a fully integrated and enclosed factory complex, including dormitories, a church, and then the factories. And so they would go and live there full time for a couple years, and this had a couple different effects. On the one hand, of course, it's much more efficient production. And on the other hand, although it was somewhat oppressive for the young women, it was an opportunity for them to get out of their family's house and get out of their little village and connect and see more of the world. And so, in a lot of ways, this expanded the horizons of a lot of young women, which would have profound effects on their beliefs about their role in society and the world, which we'll be talking about shortly. Also led to the growth of the middle class as you start to get these factory owners and managers who are wealthier, but not like the wealthiest of merchants. And so the middle class is a notoriously difficult sort of concept to pin down, but I'm just going to say it's someone who has a little bit of extra money and the time to enjoy it. So they can buy things like, a picture to hang on the wall and a fancy rug, and they can afford to sit down and read the newspaper and ignore their children. It also clearly set up a divide between work at the factory and life at home, where you have this productive time where you're out earning money. And then when you're at home, there's this domestic sphere that is much more based upon leisure. So the separation of home life from work life really profoundly changed a variety of different things, including, of course, gender roles. Another thing that factored into this whole deal was the cotton boom. The cotton boom is, of course, mostly credited to Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which was able to quite simply, it was a machine that could remove the sort of sticky seeds from cotton much more easily. And this led to the growth of the cotton kingdom across the South, because the cotton grew very well throughout a lot of these new areas that they were moving into. And so, whereas previously Southern plantations had been focused on tobacco, during this time period, we're starting to see the growth of the cotton plantation, which of course is going to have a series of predictable and unfortunate effects. So, mainly the growth of slavery, because here you see the expansion of slavery, and here you see the expansion of cotton, and they are almost identical. And so slavery is going to expand drastically. It had been, as you hopefully remember, had been somewhat on the decline since the American Revolution with the first emancipation. But you're going to see a significant expansion in slavery in general with very unfortunate societal effects as these cotton plantations are run mostly through slave labor. And this cash crop creates a massive amount of wealth, both for the Southern planters who are planting it, and for the northern merchants who are then spinning it into cloth. The international slave trade had mostly broken down by this point. England was starting to get out of the whole slavery business on account of one, it was becoming less profitable, and two, the immorality of selling humans as property, kind of. And so what you ended up getting is a domestic slave trade where old slave owning families start, for lack of a better word, and my apologies, start raising slaves in order to sell them and feed the domestic market. So what we end up getting in the United States is a self-propagating population of enslaved people who are then bought and sold as if they were animals, which obviously they are not. The moral flexibility necessary to support this system and profit from it is, of course, leads to the birth of this white supremacy, this Southern culture predicated on white supremacy, and a Northern culture also predicated on white supremacy, but also a willingness to ignore the suffering of enslaved people in the South. So we see the population of especially the lower South skyrocketing, whereas the upper South, the population is a much more steady growth. So you end up getting a lot of really wealthy Americans who are not in the plantation business, but now in the slave trading business. Most famously, the war hero of 1812, the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, makes his fortune buying and selling slaves. Hmm. Awkward transition here. We also have a transportation revolution in the United States. Back in the 1800s, moving from the coast to inland areas was incredibly difficult and honestly often impossible. With the idea that going from Ohio to New York would often be a journey of weeks, which someone would maybe only undertake once or probably no zero times in their life. Because there was a lack of infrastructure, this was one of the things that hampered our ability to invade Canada in the War of 1812 and also prevented American markets from growing because there was really just no effective way to get goods inland. Traveling across the Appalachian Mountains just took way too long. So we started a boom of a transportation boom, building both roads and canals, which we sort of talked about before, but we're going to go into more detail here. One of the new inventions that helped facilitate this boom was the steamboat, which we're going to give credit to Robert Fulton, even though he was one of a number of people producing these steamboats, because his steamboat is more or less the model that we ended up going with. So here's a steamboat, which obviously is a boat that runs on steam power and significantly increases the ability of these boats to move up rivers and through canals. So, with that, here's your Robert Fulton. With that, we get a canal building boom, which hopefully you know canals. They're man-made rivers, but they are incredibly expensive to build, but very, very profitable and an absolute game changer for the regions that get them. And so the Erie Canal is one of the famous and longest canals that was built, connecting, of course, Buffalo, New York, all the way to Albany. More importantly, connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. But as you can see here, there's a variety of other canals that were built, and the government spent a lot of money and time financing these canals with the idea that the benefits would be spread out to all the people living in these areas. So we get a canal building boom, and we get a road building boom, specifically these sort of toll roads or turnpikes. Here's an early turnpike. Of course, the goal of a road is to create a flat sort of area in which a cart can move more easily. Because, of course, if you can't use carts because, of course, the road is too rough or the terrain is too heavily wooded, then it really limits the amount of goods that can travel on this road. So you need to smooth out the surface in order to allow these carts to move on them. And you need to, of course, build some sort of a foundation for it so it doesn't simply wash away. And so road building is, of course, a very difficult and expensive proposition. And so they need to pay for themselves somehow, and they paid for themselves generally with tolls. Here's the National Turnpike connecting Baltimore, Maryland, all the way out to Illinois at its terminus. And so the National Road is going to connect the Ohio River Valley to the East Coast and is going to also help facilitate this market revolution. And we're going to go back to our objectives here and make sure that you can articulate all these things and look at the ways in which the economic realities of the United States transformed in the years following the War of 1812.